I couldn't help but notice how my hands trembled as I served the salmon that evening, the tremor so slight that no one else would see it. But I felt it, that small betrayal of my body that comes when your heart breaks in public and you're expected to keep smiling. The dining room gleamed under crystal chandeliers, every surface polished to perfection in Amanda's house. My son Michael sat at the head of the table like he'd been born to wealth, his posture straighter than I'd ever seen it, his laugh a little too loud. 28 candles flickered on the elaborate birthday cake I'd spent 2 days making, vanilla layers with raspberry filling, just the way Amanda liked it, though she'd never once asked about my preferences. "More wine, Mrs. Harrison?" I asked softly, holding the bottle I'd brought as my contribution to the dinner. It wasn't expensive. My Social Security barely covered rent and groceries, but it was the best I could afford. Amanda glanced at the label with that polite smile she'd perfected, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Oh, that's sweet. But we opened the good bottles tonight. Michael brought home something special from his business trip." I nodded and stepped back, retreating to my corner of the conversation like I'd learned to do over the past 3 years. Ever since Michael married Amanda, ever since he'd moved into this world of country club memberships and dinner parties where people discussed vacation homes like other families discuss the weather. "Mom makes the most incredible desserts," Michael was telling his father-in-law, gesturing toward the cake with genuine pride. For a moment, my heart lifted. He still remembered. He still valued something I could give. But then Amanda's father, Richard, who insisted I call him Mr. Whitmore, despite my being old enough to be his sister, chuckled in that way wealthy men do when they're about to say something they find amusing. "Well, that's wonderful. Everyone needs their little hobbies, don't they? Keeps the hands busy." Little hobbies. As if the love I poured into every meal, every birthday cake, every holiday dinner was just something to pass the time. I watched Michael's face, waiting for him to correct his father-in-law, to explain that cooking wasn't my hobby, but my gift, my way of caring for people. Instead, he nodded along, cutting another piece of cake without meeting my eyes. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, topics I couldn't contribute to. Board meetings and investment portfolios and private school recommendations for children who didn't exist yet. I sat in my simple black dress, the one I'd worn to every family gathering for 2 years, because it was the only one that seemed appropriate for these occasions, and tried to remember when I'd last felt like I belonged anywhere. "Margaret makes the best pot roast," Amanda said suddenly, and I looked up, surprised to hear my name. "Don't you, Margaret? That's what you're known for, isn't it?" There was something in her tone, something sweet and sharp at the same time, like honey with glass in it. The other guests turned their attention to me, and I felt myself shrinking under their polite interest. Yes, I suppose so," I managed. "You should make it for us sometime," Richard suggested. "We love good comfort food, don't we? Nothing fancy, just the simple things." Simple things. The phrase echoed in my head as I nodded and smiled. Everything about me was simple to them. My clothes, my home, my contributions to their lives. I was the woman who made pot roast and birthday cakes, who could be counted on to babysit when they wanted a night out, who never asked for anything more complicated than a phone call on my birthday. But then Michael spoke, and the words that came out of his mouth changed everything. "She's always been good at that stuff," he said, his voice carrying across the table with casual dismissal. "Taking care of the house, cooking, cleaning. She's basically been my old maid since Dad left." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Then Amanda laughed, a bright, delighted sound that seemed to give everyone else permission to join in. Mr. Whitmore chuckled. Mrs. Whitmore covered her smile with her napkin. Even the other guests, people I barely knew, found something amusing in my son's description of our relationship. Old maid. The words hit me like cold water, stealing my breath and making my vision blur at the edges. Not my mother who sacrificed everything. Not the woman who raised me alone. Just an old maid, a servant, a convenience, someone whose value could be reduced to household tasks, and whose presence was tolerated rather than treasured. I looked at Michael, really looked at him, searching his face for some sign that he understood what he'd just said, what he'd just done to me in front of all these people. But his expression was relaxed, almost pleased, as if he'd made a particularly clever joke. This was my son, the baby I'd held through countless nights when fever made him restless, the child I'd taught to ride a bicycle, running beside him on tired legs after 10-hour shifts at the diner. The teenager I'd supported through his first heartbreak, his college applications, his dreams of business success that had seemed so far beyond our small apartment's walls. I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his education, cleaning offices before dawn, serving lunch at the diner, stocking shelves at the grocery store until midnight. My hands were permanently stained from industrial cleaners, my feet ached from standing on concrete floors, my back curved from years of bending over other people's messes. But it had all seemed worthwhile because it was for him, for his future, for the life I wanted him to have. And now he sat in his expensive suit, in his wife's expensive house, calling me his old maid while strangers laughed at the punchline I'd apparently become. "Well," I said quietly, setting down my napkin and standing with all the dignity I could gather, "I think I should head home." "Oh, don't be silly," Amanda protested, but her tone was automatic, the kind of politeness that expects to be ignored. "We haven't even cut the cake properly." "You enjoy it," I told her, leaning down to kiss her cheek, because that's what good mothers-in-law do. "Happy birthday, dear." Michael barely looked up as I gathered my purse and cardigan. "Drive safe, Mom." "Thanks for the cake." "Thanks for the cake." As if I were the caterer, dismissed with casual appreciation after performing my function, I walked to my old Honda in their circular driveway, past the luxury cars that gleamed under the porch lights, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. Through the dining room windows, I could see them all still seated around the table, the conversation already flowing as if I'd never been there at all. The drive home took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively smaller, less manicured, until I reached my apartment complex with its cracked sidewalks and flickering security lights. My 1-bedroom unit felt impossibly quiet after the dinner party chatter, filled with the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where Michael had done homework 20 years ago, where I'd balanced checkbooks and paid bills and planned grocery lists that stretched every dollar until it screamed. The surface bore rings from countless mugs and the faint impressions of pencil marks from a child who'd pressed too hard while learning to write his name. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like a sunflower, was a photo from Michael's college graduation. In it, he's wearing his cap and gown, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. I'd been so proud that day, so certain that all the sacrifice had been worth it. He'd gotten the education I'd never had, the opportunities I'd never dreamed of, the future I'd worked myself into the ground to provide. But tonight, looking at that photo, I wondered when exactly I'd become disposable to him. When had his love transformed into tolerance? When had my presence in his life become something to apologize for rather than celebrate? The tea grew cold in my hands as I sat there, thinking about old maids and the particular cruelty of being dismissed by someone you'd given everything to save. Tomorrow, I knew, my phone wouldn't ring with an apology. Michael would probably forget the comment entirely, file it away as just another dinner party conversation that meant nothing to anyone important. But I wouldn't forget. And for the first time in 57 years, I began to wonder what it might feel like to stop trying so hard to be worth someone's love. If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here who understand what it means to love without being seen. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. The phone calls became shorter after that dinner. Where Michael used to check in twice a week, sometimes just to chat about his day or ask for advice about work situations, now our conversations felt scripted, obligatory. "Hi, Mom. Just calling to see how you're doing." "I'm fine, sweetheart. How are you and Amanda?" "Good, good. Busy with work. Listen, I can't talk long." And that would be it. 5 minutes of polite updates before he found an excuse to hang up. No more stories about his colleagues or questions about my week. No more comfortable silences where we could just enjoy each other's company across the phone line. I started marking the calls on my calendar, a small check mark next to the date. Tuesday, March 3rd, Saturday, March 14th, Thursday, March 26th. The gaps grew longer, the conversations grew shorter, and slowly I realized I was becoming a chore on his to-do list. Somewhere between paying bills and getting his car serviced, Amanda's influence crept into everything like water finding cracks. Michael's vocabulary changed first. Suddenly he was using words like networking and optimizing, and referring to my neighborhood as that area. When I mentioned my friend Dorothy from the apartment complex, he'd make vague sounds of acknowledgement, but I could hear him losing interest in real time. "Mom, "You should really think about joining some kind of senior center," he said one afternoon, his voice carrying that particular tone adult children use when they're trying to solve a problem they don't want to deal with themselves. "You need to get out more, meet people your own age, people my own age." As if, at 57, I'd somehow aged out of relevance to his life. As if our relationship had an expiration date tied to my birthday rather than to the love between mother and son. "I get out plenty," I told him, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. My world had grown smaller since his marriage, contracted around work and grocery shopping and the occasional coffee with Dorothy. "I have my routines." "That's exactly what I mean," he said, and I could picture him shaking his head the way he used to when I didn't understand something he thought was obvious. "You need new routines, different activities." Amanda's mother is on 3 different committees at their country club. She's always busy with something. Amanda's mother. The comparison hung between us like a banner announcing my inadequacy. Nancy Whitmore with her tennis lessons and charity galas and vacation homes, who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow managed to fill every moment with purpose and social importance. I wanted to ask him if Nancy had ever worked 3 jobs to keep him fed and housed, if she'd ever chosen between paying the electric bill or buying school supplies, if she'd ever fallen asleep standing up from exhaustion, held upright only by love and stubbornness, and the absolute certainty that someone was counting on her. But I didn't ask those questions because I already knew the answers. And more importantly, I knew they wouldn't matter to him anymore. The distance became physical too. Michael stopped dropping by unannounced, something he'd done regularly during his first 2 years of marriage. I used to love those surprise visits, hearing his key in the lock, his voice calling, "Mom, you home?" as he made himself comfortable at my kitchen table and told me about his latest work project or weekend plans. Now he called first, always. "Is it okay if I stop by around 3? I can only stay for about an hour." As if my time had become valuable enough to schedule, or as if his had become too precious to waste on spontaneous mother-son conversations. When he did visit, he seemed restless, checking his phone frequently and glancing at the door like he was calculating escape routes. We'd sit in my living room, the same couch where we'd watched countless movies together, where I'd helped him with homework, where he'd told me about his first job interview, and struggled to find conversation that lasted more than 10 minutes. "The place looks good, Mom," he'd say, his eyes scanning my modest furniture with the polite interest of someone visiting an acquaintance. "Really good." But I could see what he was really thinking. The apartment that had once felt cozy now seemed shabby compared to Amanda's house. My carefully maintained furniture looked worn next to their designer pieces. Even my proudest possessions, the quilt my grandmother had made, the china set I'd saved for years to buy, seemed suddenly old-fashioned and sad. The worst part was watching him edit himself around me. Michael had always been animated when he talked, using his hands to gesture and his whole face to express excitement or frustration. But now he sat carefully, his posture controlled, his language measured. He told me about work in general terms, about weekend plans that didn't include me, about Amanda's family gatherings that I'd stopped being invited to. "We're going to the Whitmore's lake house next weekend," he'd say. "Amanda's cousin is bringing his new boat." "That sounds wonderful," I'd reply. And we'd both pretend not to notice that he hadn't invited me, that my presence at family gatherings had become awkward somehow, unnecessary. I started finding excuses to call him instead of waiting for his scheduled check-ins. Little things, a recipe I thought Amanda might like, news about a neighbor, questions about his work that I could have Googled myself. But even those conversations felt forced, like I was interrupting something more important. "Mom, can I call you back later? We're just heading out to dinner." "Of course, sweetheart. Have fun." Later never came, of course. Or it came 3 days later with an apology that felt practiced. "Sorry I forgot to call back. It's been crazy here." I began to understand that I was becoming an obligation rather than a choice, a duty rather than a joy. The realization settled into my bones like winter cold, the kind that no amount of blankets or hot tea can chase away. Dorothy noticed first. We were having coffee in my kitchen, the way we did every Thursday morning, when she looked at me with those sharp eyes that had seen 80 years of human behavior. "You're different lately," she said, stirring sugar into her cup with deliberate slowness. "Quieter, sadder. What's going on?" I tried to explain without sounding like I was complaining about my son, without betraying the growing certainty that Michael was embarrassed by me. But Dorothy had raised 4 children of her own, had lived through enough family dynamics to recognize the signs. "He's pulling away," she said simply. "It happens sometimes when kids get married, especially when they marry up. They start seeing their old life through new eyes, and sometimes they don't like what they see." "But I'm his mother," I said, the words sounding childish even to me. "Yes," Dorothy agreed. "But you're also a reminder of where he came from, and maybe that doesn't fit with where he's trying to go." That night, I looked through photo albums I hadn't opened in months. Pictures of Michael at every age, gap-toothed and grinning after losing his first tooth, serious in his Little League uniform, proud at high school graduation. In every photo, he was looking at the camera with complete confidence that he was loved, that he mattered, that the person taking the picture would always be there to capture his important moments. When had I stopped being the person he wanted to capture his moments? When had my love become a burden instead of a blessing? I closed the albums and put them back in their drawer, but the questions lingered. And for the first time since he'd called me his old maid, I began to wonder if trying to hold on to someone who was determined to let go was just another form of breaking my own heart. The silence in my apartment that night felt different than usual. Not peaceful, but waiting. Like something was shifting beneath the surface of our relationship. Something that couldn't be fixed with better phone calls or more interesting conversation. Something that might require me to finally stop pretending that love was always enough to bridge the growing distance between a mother and the son she'd raised to want more than she could ever be. I decided to try harder. That's what mothers do, isn't it? When something breaks, we find ways to fix it. When distance grows, we build bridges. When love feels strained, we love more deliberately, more carefully, with the precision of someone trying to thread a needle in dim light. For Michael's 32nd birthday, I planned something special. Not expensive, I couldn't compete with Amanda's family in that arena, but meaningful, personal. I spent weeks working on a photo album, not the digital kind that everyone made now, but a real book with real photographs printed and carefully arranged by hand. I gathered pictures spanning his entire life. Michael at 6 months old, sleeping in my arms during one of those endless nights when I was so tired I could barely see straight. His first day of school, when he'd cried and clung to my leg before finally letting the teacher coax him inside. High school graduation, where he'd searched the crowd until he found my face and given me that smile that said everything would be okay, because we'd made it together. Between the photos, I wrote small notes in my best handwriting, memories he might have forgotten, stories about his childhood that only I knew. The time he'd brought me dandelions and insisted they were the most beautiful flowers in the world. How he'd practiced his first job interview with me, sitting across from each other at my kitchen table while I asked him questions I'd researched online. It took me 3 weeks to finish, working on it every evening after dinner, my reading glasses perched on my nose as I carefully glued each photo and wrote each memory. When it was done, I wrapped it in brown paper and tied it with the kind of string bow I'd learned to make when he was little and we couldn't afford fancy gift wrap. I called to arrange the visit. "I have something for your birthday," I told him. Something I made. There was a pause, and in that pause, I heard his reluctance as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. "Mom, you didn't need to do anything special. We're just having a quiet dinner at home." "I know, but I wanted to. It won't take long." Another pause. "Amanda's making dinner at 6. You could come by around 4. We'll have coffee." An hour. He was giving me an hour of his birthday, scheduled between whatever he'd planned for the afternoon and the dinner his wife was preparing. But I took it because it was what was offered, and because I'd learned that begging for more time only made him more uncomfortable. I arrived exactly at 4, carrying the wrapped album and a small grocery store cake because I couldn't bear to show up empty-handed on his birthday. Michael answered the door wearing clothes I'd never seen before, casual but expensive looking, the kind of effortless style that Amanda had taught him. "Hi, Mom," he said, accepting my hug with the polite warmth of someone greeting an aunt they saw twice a year. "Come in. Amanda's upstairs getting ready for dinner." We sat in their living room, and I presented the album with the nervous excitement of a child showing a teacher a special project. Michael unwrapped it carefully, his face arranging itself into an expression of appropriate interest. "It's a photo album," I explained unnecessarily as he opened the cover. "I thought you might like to have some of the old pictures, stories you might not remember." He turned the pages slowly, and I watched his face for signs of recognition, pleasure, connection. There were moments, a small smile when he saw himself at 10, gap-toothed and proud in his baseball uniform, a soft laugh at the photo of him covered in flour after trying to help me bake cookies, but mostly he looked polite, interested in the way you might be interested in someone else's family photos. "This is really nice, Mom," he said when he reached the last page. "Really thoughtful. Thank you." Thoughtful. The word felt like a small knife between my ribs. Not wonderful, not meaningful, not treasured. Thoughtful, like something a helpful neighbor might do. Amanda appeared in the doorway, dressed for whatever dinner plans I wasn't part of. "Oh, what a lovely gift," she said, glancing at the album without really looking at it. "How sweet of you to put that together." Sweet. Another word that diminished rather than celebrated. Sweet like a child's drawing stuck to a refrigerator out of obligation rather than pride. "I should get going," I said, standing because the hour was nearly up and I could feel their politeness wearing thin. "I don't want to keep you from your evening." Michael walked me to the door, carrying the grocery store cake I'd brought. "Thanks for this, and for the album," he said. Really thoughtful. That word again. I wanted to tell him that I'd spent 3 weeks working on it, that each photo had been chosen with care, that every memory I'd written had been selected to remind him of how much he'd been loved. Instead, I smiled and kissed his cheek. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." I was halfway to my car when I heard Amanda's voice through their open window. "That's so nice that she made you that book. My grandmother used to do things like that. You know, crafty projects. It's sweet how older people stay busy with their little hobbies." Little hobbies. The same phrase her father had used about my cooking. As if love transformed into labor was just something to keep my hands occupied, not a gift from my heart to his. Michael's response was quieter, but I caught it. "Yeah, she's always been good at that kind of thing." That kind of thing. Handmade gifts, personal gestures, mother's love expressed through time and effort rather than money and status. That kind of thing had become quaint, old-fashioned, something to be tolerated rather than treasured. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching their house glow with warm light, imagining the birthday dinner Amanda was preparing with ingredients they'd bought without checking prices, in a kitchen equipped with appliances I could never afford. They would eat off china that matched, drink wine that cost more than my electric bill, discuss plans and dreams and futures that had no place for grocery store cakes or handmade photo albums. The drive home felt longer than usual, every mile a reminder that I was traveling back to a different world. My apartment, which had always felt like home, suddenly seemed smaller and shabbier. The photos on my refrigerator, mostly of Michael at various ages, looked desperate somehow, like shrines to a relationship that existed more in my memory than in present reality. 2 weeks later, I tried again. Amanda had mentioned in passing during one of their brief phone calls that they were thinking of repainting their guest room. I offered to help, remembering how Michael and I had painted his bedroom when he was 12, working side by side and laughing when we got more paint on ourselves than on the walls. "Oh, that's really generous," Amanda said, her voice bright with the kind of enthusiasm that means no. "But we're having it professionally done. Michael's back has been bothering him lately, and I just think it's better to have experts handle it." Experts. As if I didn't have 40 years of experience maintaining my own home. As if the countless rooms I'd painted and repainted didn't qualify as expertise. As if offering to help was presumptuous, rather than loving. I started bringing food when I visited, thinking that surely they could use homemade meals. I'd always been a good cook, creative with simple ingredients, able to make modest groceries stretch into satisfying dinners. My lasagna had been Michael's favorite growing up, and my chicken soup could cure anything that ailed him, but now my offerings were received with polite thanks and what I gradually recognized as subtle redirections. "Oh, you shouldn't have gone to so much trouble," Amanda would say, accepting the covered dish with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We actually have dinner plans tonight, but I'm sure we can freeze this for later." Freeze for later. Code for, we don't really want this, but we're too polite to refuse directly. Michael started sending thank you texts instead of calling to tell me how the food had been. Short messages. "Thanks for the soup, Mom. Very good." As if I were a restaurant he was reviewing rather than his mother sharing love through the language I'd always used to express care. I noticed that my dishes were returned cleaned but quickly, sometimes within days of my bringing them. Once, I forgot to put my name on a casserole dish. And when I asked about it a month later, Amanda looked genuinely confused. "Oh, I think we might have donated that with some other things," she said. "Was it special? I can get you a new one." Donated. My grandmother's ceramic baking dish, the one I'd used to make Michael's birthday cakes for 30 years, had been donated to charity because it wasn't worth keeping track of. The final attempt came in October. Michael mentioned, almost in passing, that Amanda's book club was reading a novel I'd enjoyed years earlier. I thought maybe this was a bridge we could build, intellectual conversation, shared interests beyond my domestic skills. I read the book again, taking notes this time, preparing thoughtful observations about themes and characters. When I called to share my thoughts, excited to finally have something sophisticated to contribute to their social world, Michael listened politely for about 3 minutes. "That's interesting, Mom," he said. "I'll tell Amanda you liked it. Listen, I should probably let you go. We're meeting friends for drinks." Meeting friends. The phrase that had become his standard excuse for ending conversations with me. Always friends I didn't know, social events I wasn't invited to, a life that existed entirely separate from my place in it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter I would never send. In it, I told Michael everything I wanted him to know about love and sacrifice, and the particular pain of being dismissed by someone you'd shaped from clay into a man. I wrote about the nights I'd worked late to pay for his college applications, the dreams I'd deferred to fund his dreams, the pride I'd felt watching him succeed at things I'd never had the education to understand. I wrote about how it felt to love someone who'd grown embarrassed of that love, who'd decided that the price of belonging in a new world was leaving his old one behind. I wrote about the difference between being grateful for someone's sacrifices and being ashamed of the need for those sacrifices to have been made. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and put it in my jewelry box, next to the modest engagement ring Michael's father had given me 33 years earlier. Both were artifacts of love that had been real once, evidence of connections that had mattered, even though they'd ended. But sometimes, love isn't enough to make someone stay. Sometimes gratitude turns to guilt, and guilt transforms into distance, and distance becomes indifference so gradually that everyone involved can pretend it's natural evolution rather than deliberate abandonment. The letter stayed in my jewelry box, and I learned to stop trying so hard to be worthy of time and attention that was no longer freely given. I stopped calling first. It was a small decision, made on a Tuesday morning in November while I sat at my kitchen table with coffee that had grown cold while I stared at my phone. For months, I'd been the one initiating most of our conversations, carefully timing my calls so they wouldn't interrupt his work or his dinner plans or whatever social obligations filled his evenings now. But that morning, something shifted inside me. A quiet recognition that I'd been working harder to maintain our relationship than he was, that love shouldn't require such careful scheduling and polite persistence. So I set the phone aside and waited. The silence that followed was more telling than any conversation we'd had in months. 1 day passed, then 2. By the end of the first week, I'd stopped looking at the phone expectantly every time it rang. By the end of the second week, I'd begun to understand that Michael hadn't noticed the change, or if he had, he was relieved by it. When he finally did call, 18 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, his voice carried no awareness that anything had been different. "Hi, Mom, just checking in. How are you doing?" "I'm fine," I said, and realized I meant it in a way I hadn't expected. Not happy, not fulfilled, but fine in the sense that I was managing, surviving, adapting to a reality I'd been fighting against for too long. Good. Sorry I haven't called lately. Work's been crazy, and Amanda's been planning this charity thing for her mother's garden club. Amanda's mother's garden club. Another world I would never be part of. Another obligation that took precedence over a 5-minute conversation with the woman who'd raised him. "That's nice," I said, because what else was there to say? We talked for exactly 7 minutes. I know because I'd started timing our calls, not out of spite, but out of a growing scientific curiosity about how little time my son felt I deserved. 7 minutes to cover his work, Amanda's activities, the weather, and my health. 7 minutes to maintain the illusion of a relationship between two people who'd once been each other's whole world. After I hung up, I looked around my apartment and saw it differently than I had in months. Not through Michael's eyes anymore. The shabby furniture, the outdated decorations, the small spaces that had seemed to shrink every time he visited. Instead, I saw it as my space, arranged for my comfort, filled with things that pleased me regardless of what anyone else might think. The china cabinet that had seemed old-fashioned and sad suddenly looked stately to me. My grandmother's dishes, carefully preserved through decades of careful use, represented continuity and history rather than outdated taste. The quilt on my sofa, which Amanda had once described as charming, in a tone that made charm sound like a character flaw, was warm and beautiful and made by hands that had loved me. I began to reclaim my evenings. For months, I'd kept them open, available for the phone calls that came less and less frequently, the surprise visits that had stopped coming entirely. I'd turned down invitations from Dorothy, declined opportunities to join community activities, maintained a schedule that revolved around being accessible to someone who'd stopped reaching for me. But now I accepted Dorothy's invitation to join her book club. I started attending the Tuesday evening yoga class at the community center, something I'd been curious about for years but had never prioritized. I bought a small television for my bedroom and began watching the shows I enjoyed without worrying about whether they were sophisticated enough to discuss with people who might judge my entertainment choices. The changes were small, but significant. I stopped buying ingredients for elaborate meals I might cook if Michael visited unexpectedly. Instead, I prepared simple foods I enjoyed. Salads with ingredients I'd never splurged on before, soups made in small batches for one person, desserts I could finish without feeling wasteful. I started reading again, not with the intention of discussing books with Amanda's book club, but for the pure pleasure of losing myself in stories. I checked out novels from the library without considering whether they were impressive enough to mention in conversation, mysteries and romances and literary fiction chosen based on nothing more than whether the first page made me want to continue reading. My phone rang less often, and gradually I stopped jumping every time I heard it. Most calls weren't from Michael anyway. Telemarketers, appointment reminders, Dorothy checking in with updates about neighbors or invitations to coffee. My son had become one possible caller among many rather than the person I was always hoping to hear from. The loneliness was different now. Before, it had been sharp and desperate, the pain of reaching for someone who was pulling away. But this new loneliness was softer, more like a low-grade sadness that I could carry without it consuming everything else. I was alone, but I was no longer actively being rejected. The absence of connection hurt less than the presence of indifference. Christmas approached, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't begin planning elaborate celebrations weeks in advance. No lists of gifts to save for, no menu planning for dishes that would impress Amanda's family, no anxious preparation for gatherings where I'd smile and nod and pretend not to notice how little space was made for me in conversations. Instead, I bought a small tree that fit comfortably in my living room and decorated it with ornaments that meant something to me. Some were handmade decorations Michael had created in elementary school, his name written in child's handwriting on construction paper angels and salt dough stars. Others were gifts from my parents, Christmases when we'd had little money but had made magic anyway through creativity and love. Looking at the tree, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: contentment. Not the desperate happiness I'd been chasing through perfect gifts and elaborate gestures, but quiet satisfaction with something simple and beautiful that belonged entirely to me. Michael called 3 days before Christmas to discuss plans. "We're doing Christmas morning at the Whitmores," he said. "Big family thing, you know how it is. But maybe we could do something with you later in the week. Amanda thought maybe we could take you out for brunch on the 28th. Take me out for brunch. Like I was an elderly relative being managed rather than his mother who'd spent 31 previous Christmases making the holiday magical for him. "That's thoughtful of you both," I said, "but I actually have plans that day." I didn't, but I would by the time the 28th arrived. Dorothy had mentioned a movie she wanted to see, and there was a new restaurant across town I'd been curious about. Plans that centered around what I wanted to do rather than fitting into whatever leftover time someone else might have available. There was a pause on Michael's end, and I realized this might have been the first time in years that I'd been unavailable when he'd offered me his time. "Oh," he said. "Well, maybe the weekend after New Year's? Let me check my calendar and get back to you," I told him, though we both knew my calendar had been embarrassingly empty for months, but that was changing. I'd joined the book club, committed to yoga classes, volunteered to help with inventory at the library. Small commitments that gave structure to my weeks and put me in contact with people who were genuinely pleased to see me, who valued my contributions and treated me like someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. That Christmas Eve, I cooked dinner for one, not sadly, not as a consolation prize, but as a celebration of my own company. I used my grandmother's china, lit candles, played music I loved, and prepared foods that pleased me without considering anyone else's preferences or dietary restrictions. As I sat at my table, eating slowly and watching snow fall outside my window, I realized something had fundamentally changed. The desperate ache for Michael's approval, the constant anxiety about whether I was enough for his new life, had been replaced by something quieter but stronger. The recognition that I had value independent of his acknowledgement of it. I was still his mother. I still loved him with the fierce, uncomplicated love that had sustained me through 32 years of single parenthood. But I was also Margaret, a woman with interests and friendships and capabilities that existed entirely separate from my relationship to him. For the first time in months, I went to bed without checking my phone to see if I'd missed any calls. For the first time in even longer, I fell asleep without that familiar hollow feeling in my chest, that sense that something essential was missing from my life. The emptiness was still there, but it had changed shape. Instead of a desperate void demanding to be filled by someone else's attention, it had become space. Room for possibilities I hadn't considered, opportunities I'd been too focused on Michael to notice. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. Not just the love I'd always had for my son, but the strength I'd developed in raising him, the resilience that had gotten us through years of struggle and uncertainty. That strength hadn't disappeared when he'd pulled away from me. I'd just forgotten it existed. Now, in the quiet of my apartment, with my small Christmas tree glowing in the corner and my future stretching ahead like an unwritten page, I was beginning to remember who I'd been before I'd defined myself entirely through someone else's needs. It started with the jewelry box. On a quiet February morning, while organizing my bedroom closet, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor with the small wooden box I'd owned since my 20th birthday. Inside, beneath the unsent letter to Michael, lay pieces I hadn't looked at in years. My mother's pearl earrings, the ones she'd worn to my high school graduation, a silver bracelet my father had given me for my 21st birthday, back when such a gift represented weeks of overtime at the factory. And tucked beneath everything else, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was something I'd almost forgotten I owned. The ring wasn't much to look at, a simple gold band with 3 small diamonds arranged in a modest cluster. But when I slipped it onto my finger, muscle memory brought back a flood of details from the day I'd bought it for myself, 15 years ago. It had been a celebration, a reward for something no one else had thought to commemorate. Michael had just graduated from college, and after years of sacrificing every luxury, every small pleasure, every personal want to fund his education, I'd done something unprecedented. I'd kept a paycheck entirely for myself. Not the whole amount, of course. Bills still needed paying, and there was always something that required immediate attention. But I'd held back enough to walk into that small jewelry store downtown and choose something beautiful just because I wanted it. Just because I'd earned it through years of working multiple jobs and putting someone else's dreams ahead of my own comfort. The saleswoman had been kind, patient with my careful examination of pieces within my modest budget. When I'd finally pointed to the ring, she'd smiled and said, "That's a beautiful choice. Is it for a special occasion?" "Yes," I'd told her, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "It's for me." Wearing it now, I remembered how powerful that simple statement had felt. Not for my son's graduation gift, not for someone else's approval or expectation. For me, because I deserved something beautiful, something that acknowledged the woman I'd been even while everyone else focused on the mother I'd become. I'd worn the ring for a few weeks back then, delighting in the way it caught the light as I worked, the small daily reminder that I was more than just a vehicle for someone else's success. But gradually, as Michael's job search began and other expenses arose, wearing it had started to feel selfish, a frivolous indulgence when practical concerns demanded attention. So I'd tucked it away, telling myself I'd bring it out again when circumstances were different, when I could enjoy luxury without guilt. Somehow, 15 years had passed without those circumstances ever feeling quite right. But now, sitting in my bedroom with winter sunlight streaming through the window, I understood that the right circumstances weren't something that happened to you. They were something you created for yourself. I kept the ring on that day, and the next, and the day after that. Such a small thing, but it changed how I moved through the world. When I caught my reflection in store windows or bathroom mirrors, I saw someone who had chosen to adorn herself, someone who believed she deserved beautiful things. At the book club that Thursday, Dorothy noticed immediately. "That's gorgeous," she said, gesturing to my hand as we settled into our chairs at the library. "Is it new?" "Old, actually," I told her. I'd just forgotten I had it. But Mrs. Patterson, who'd been leading the book discussion for 6 years, leaned forward with the interest of someone who recognized a story when she heard one. "Sometimes we need to rediscover our own treasures," she said. "Remind ourselves of who we were before life convinced us to put certain parts of ourselves away." The conversation stayed with me as we discussed that month's novel, a story about a woman who'd spent decades caring for others before finally learning to care for herself. The parallels weren't subtle, but they weren't unwelcome either. Sometimes you needed external mirrors to see your own situation clearly. Walking home after the meeting, I found myself taking a different route, one that led past the small art gallery that had opened near the community center. I'd noticed it before, but had never felt I had reason to go inside. Art galleries seemed like spaces for people with education and cultural sophistication, people who could discuss technique and historical context with confidence. But the ring on my finger caught the gallery's window light, and something about that small sparkle gave me permission to open the door and step inside. The paintings were modest in size and scope, local artists displaying landscapes and portraits that captured familiar scenes with fresh eyes. Nothing intimidating or incomprehensible, just honest work that made me see my own surroundings differently. "See anything that speaks to you?" asked the woman at the front desk, her voice genuinely curious rather than pushy. I found myself standing in front of a small watercolor depicting a woman's hands working in a garden, soil under her fingernails, wedding ring catching sunlight as she tended to something growing. The artist had painted those hands with such care, such obvious love for their subject, that I could almost feel the earth beneath my own fingers. "I paint hands a lot," the gallery owner said, joining me in front of the piece. "There's so much story in hands, don't you think? All the work they've done, all the love they've given, all the strength they've built over years of use." I looked down at my own hands, work worn from decades of cleaning and cooking and caring. The ring made them look different somehow, not just functional, but purposeful, not just tools for serving others, but expressions of a person who had chosen to create beauty in small, daily ways. "The artist is local," the woman continued. "She's in her 70s, started painting seriously after her husband died. Said she needed to find something that was just hers, something that had nothing to do with being anyone's wife or mother, something that was just hers." The phrase echoed in my mind as I walked home, past houses where other people lived their complicated lives, where other women might be discovering their own forgotten treasures, or learning to want things just for themselves. That evening, instead of my usual routine of dinner and television, I pulled out supplies I hadn't touched in years. A sketchbook Michael had given me for Christmas when he was 16, thinking I might enjoy drawing as a hobby. Pencils that had remained sharp because they'd rarely been used. An art set that had seemed too precious to waste on amateur attempts. I sat at my kitchen table and drew my own hands, the ring prominent on my finger, trying to capture not just their appearance but their history. The scars from kitchen accidents while preparing countless meals, the calluses from years of physical work, the gentle curve that had patted Michael's fevered forehead through childhood illnesses and smoothed his hair during bedtime stories, but also the strength in those fingers, the capability, the creative potential that had been dormant rather than absent all these years. The drawing wasn't professional quality, but it was mine. A record of hands that had worked and loved and sacrificed, but also hands that could create something beautiful just because their owner wanted to try. I taped it to my refrigerator next to the old photos of Michael, not to replace those memories, but to balance them with evidence of who I'd always been beyond my role as his mother. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The desperate need for Michael's approval, the constant ache of trying to fit into a life that had no real place for me, had been replaced by something steadier and more sustainable. The recognition that my worth wasn't determined by someone else's acknowledgement of it. I was still disappointed by the distance between us, still wished our relationship could return to the easy closeness we'd once shared. But that disappointment no longer consumed me. no longer defined my daily emotional landscape. Instead, I was discovering what it felt like to live for myself again, to make choices based on my own preferences rather than someone else's comfort. Small choices, mostly. What books to read, what shows to watch, how to spend my evenings and weekends. But each choice was a quiet declaration of independence, a gentle rebellion against the idea that my life's value could be measured only by how well I served others. At the yoga class that Tuesday, I found myself holding poses longer, breathing deeper, taking up space without apologizing for it. When the instructor asked us to set an intention for our practice, I didn't think about being a better mother or finding ways to reconnect with Michael. Instead, I set the intention to remember my own strength, to honor the woman who had raised a son alone while working multiple jobs, who had sacrificed without becoming bitter, who had loved without losing herself entirely, even when it had felt that way. After class, several women invited me to join them for coffee. A year ago, I would have declined, hurrying home in case Michael called or needed something. But now I accepted, settling into conversation with people who knew me as Margaret rather than Michael's mother, who were interested in my opinions about books and current events and the small dramas of community life. "You should come to the community garden planning meeting next week," suggested Linda, a retired teacher with soil-stained hands and the easy confidence of someone who'd spent decades nurturing growth. "We're always looking for people with good instincts about what helps things thrive." Good instincts about what helps things thrive. I realized she was right. I did have those instincts, developed through years of tending to Michael's needs, helping him grow from uncertain child to confident adult. But those same skills could be applied to gardens, to community projects, to friendships and personal interests I'd never had time to explore. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and as I wrote it in my calendar, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from having plans that belong entirely to you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and advertisements that filled my small mailbox. I almost missed it entirely. The envelope was cream-colored and formal, the kind of stationery that suggested importance but could just as easily have been another credit card offer or insurance solicitation. But my name was handwritten across the front in careful script, and there was something about the weight of the paper, the quality of the envelope, that made me set it aside while I sorted through the rest of my mail with more attention than usual. Inside my apartment, with coffee brewing and morning light streaming through the kitchen window, I opened the envelope carefully and found myself holding a letter that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," it began, and I had to read the first paragraph twice to believe what I was seeing. "I am writing on behalf of the Hartwell Foundation to inform you that you have been selected as this year's recipient of the Community Service Excellence Award." Community service. I set the letter down and stared at it, wondering if there had been some mistake, some confusion with another Margaret Morrison who actually deserved recognition for community contributions. But as I continued reading, the details became impossible to dismiss. The award, given annually to someone who had demonstrated exceptional dedication to helping others in their community, came with a monetary prize of $5,000 and would be presented at a ceremony the following month. The nomination, the letter explained, had come from multiple sources within the community who had observed my volunteer work at the library, my participation in the book club, and particularly my contributions to the community garden project that had transformed an empty lot into a thriving space where neighbors gathered to grow vegetables and flowers together. I had to read that paragraph 3 times before it sank in. People had been watching me, noticing my efforts, valuing my contributions enough to recommend me for recognition, not because I was someone's mother or wife, but because of work I'd been doing quietly, without fanfare, simply because it felt good to help things grow. The ceremony would be held at the community center on April 15th, and I was invited to bring family and friends to celebrate the occasion. The thought of that invitation both warmed and troubled me. Family. The word seemed to hover in the air, raising questions I'd been avoiding for months. Should I tell Michael about the award? Part of me wanted to share the news, to see if this external validation might remind him that his mother was someone worth acknowledging. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger through yoga classes and book discussions and quiet evenings spent sketching, hesitated to make this moment about seeking his approval. This recognition belonged to me. It celebrated work I'd done for my own satisfaction, connections I'd built because they brought me joy, contributions I'd made without expecting anything in return. Sharing it with Michael felt like risking the contamination of something pure with the complicated dynamics that had developed between us. I decided to wait. The ceremony was still weeks away, and perhaps by then I'd have clarity about whether including him would enhance the celebration or diminish it. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended feeling, as if I were living in the space between one version of my life and another. At the library, Mrs. Chen congratulated me warmly when she learned about the award. "You've made such a difference here," she said, gesturing toward the children's reading corner where I'd been volunteering on Saturday mornings. "The way you connect with the kids, especially the shy ones, you have a gift for making people feel seen." Making people feel seen. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd developed this skill during a period when I'd felt increasingly invisible in my own family, when the most important person in my life had seemed to look right through me. But perhaps that experience had taught me something valuable about the hunger for recognition, the deep human need to matter in someone else's story. Perhaps my own recent invisibility had made me more attuned to others who felt overlooked or undervalued. At the book club that Thursday, the women surprised me with a small celebration. A cake Dorothy had made and a card signed by everyone expressing their congratulations and appreciation for my friendship. The gesture moved me more than I'd expected, this evidence that I'd become important to people who'd started as strangers just a few months earlier. "You've changed since you started coming here," Linda observed as we cleaned up after our discussion. "Not that you weren't lovely before, but you seem more present now. More yourself, if that makes sense." More myself. I understood exactly what she meant. For so long, I'd existed primarily in relation to other people. Michael's mother, someone's employee, a customer in line at the grocery store. But lately, I'd been rediscovering what it felt like to be Margaret, a person with her own thoughts and interests and contributions to make. The award letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I moved it to a place of honor on my refrigerator, next to the photo of Michael's graduation and the sketch I'd drawn of my own hands. The contrast struck me. The past, the present, and perhaps the beginning of a future I hadn't dared to imagine. On Friday evening, as I was tending to the tomato seedlings I'd started in small pots on my windowsill, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's number, and I felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that still accompanied his calls, despite the emotional distance I'd worked to create. "Hi, Mom," he said, and there was something different in his tone. Not warmer exactly, but less hurried than usual. "How are you doing?" "I'm well," I told him, wiping soil from my hands with a dish towel. "Just working in my little garden." "Garden? I didn't know you were into gardening." The surprise in his voice reminded me how little he knew about my current life, how completely our conversations had become limited to polite exchanges that revealed nothing meaningful about either of us. "It's something new I'm trying," I said. "There's a community garden project and I've been helping out. It's quite rewarding." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him processing this information, trying to reconcile the image of his domestic, predictable mother with someone who might have interests and activities he wasn't aware of. That's really good, Mom. Good for you." The conversation continued for nearly 15 minutes, longer than we'd talked in months. Michael told me about a project at work, asked about my health, even mentioned that Amanda had commented on how busy I seemed to be lately when they'd driven past and seen me working in the garden with the other volunteers. Busy, another word that carried implications. Not just occupied, but engaged, involved, purposefully active in ways that didn't revolve around waiting for their attention. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the green shoots of my seedlings and wondered if I'd imagined the subtle shift in his tone. Had he noticed something different about me? Some change in my voice or manner that suggested his mother was no longer the same woman who'd been so eager to please, so desperate for his approval just a few months earlier. That weekend, while organizing papers in my desk drawer, I found myself looking at documents I hadn't examined in years. Bank statements, insurance policies, the deed to my small life insurance policy that I'd maintained even during the leanest years because I'd wanted to ensure Michael would have something if anything happened to me. But among these practical papers was something I'd forgotten about entirely, a folder containing documentation for the small investment account I'd opened 25 years ago. Back then, it had seemed like an impossible luxury, setting aside $25 a month when every penny was already allocated to immediate needs. But my father had insisted that even the smallest regular savings could grow over time, and I'd managed to maintain the modest contributions even during the most difficult years. I'd stopped looking at the statements years ago, assuming the account was too small to matter, contributing to it automatically while focusing my attention on more pressing financial concerns. But now, examining the most recent statement, I realized that decades of small, consistent investments had grown into something substantial, not wealth by Amanda's family's standards, but enough money to represent genuine security, genuine choices about how I wanted to live the next chapter of my life. The numbers on the page blurred as I calculated what this meant. I could afford to take classes, travel to places I'd always wanted to see, support causes that mattered to me. I could make choices based on preference rather than necessity, could say yes to opportunities that had previously seemed financially impossible. More importantly, I could make those choices without consulting anyone else, without justifying my decisions to someone who might have opinions about how I should spend money I'd earned and saved through decades of careful planning. The realization settled into my bones with a weight that was both exciting and slightly terrifying. Financial independence, even on a modest scale, meant emotional independence as well. It meant I could care less about being included in other people's plans because I had resources to make plans of my own. That evening, I called Dorothy to share the news about the award ceremony, and she immediately began planning which of her dresses would be most appropriate for such an occasion. "You know," she said, her voice carrying the particular excitement of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize significant moments, "this feels like the beginning of something important. Not just the award, but everything that's been building up. You're becoming someone new, Margaret. Or maybe you're becoming who you were always meant to be." As I prepared for bed that night, I looked out my bedroom window at the community garden visible in the distance, the small plots where neighbors were beginning to plant their spring vegetables. In a few weeks, those carefully tended spaces would be green with growth, productive in ways that served both the individual gardeners and the community as a whole. Change was coming. I could feel it in the quality of the light, in the way conversations with Michael had subtly shifted, in the growing confidence I felt about my own worth and contributions. Something was stirring beneath the surface of my ordinary life, something that would soon require me to decide who I wanted to be in this new chapter that was beginning to unfold. I decided to invite him. 3 days before the ceremony, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand, I made the choice that would change everything between us. "Michael, I have some news to share," I said when he answered, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I've received an award from the Hartwell Foundation for community service. There's a ceremony this Saturday, and I'd like you and Amanda to come if you're available." The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then, "An award? What kind of award?" I explained about the community service recognition, the nomination from multiple sources, the $5,000 prize that had left me speechless when I'd first read the letter. As I spoke, I could hear something changing in Michael's tone, a sharpening of attention that hadn't been present in our conversations for months. $5,000? He repeated. That's really something, Mom. Congratulations. Will you come?" I asked. "It's at 4 o'clock at the community center." "Of course," he said immediately. "Of course we'll be there. This is huge, Mom. Really huge." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and wondered why his enthusiasm felt more complicated than comforting. There had been something in his voice, an excitement that seemed less about celebrating my achievement and more about, what? Interest in the prize money? Curiosity about this version of his mother that apparently existed without his knowledge? The ceremony was smaller than I'd expected, but more meaningful. About 50 people gathered in the community center's main room, decorated with spring flowers from the garden project that had been central to my nomination. I recognized faces from the library, the book club, the yoga class, people who'd become part of my life's fabric without fanfare, creating a network of connection that existed entirely separate from my identity as someone's mother. Michael and Amanda arrived exactly on time, dressed in what I recognized as their careful version of dressing down, clothes that were casual but clearly expensive, the kind of effortless style that actually required significant effort to achieve. They found seats in the third row, and I watched Amanda's eyes survey the room with the polite interest of someone attending an event she didn't expect to find particularly engaging. The mayor gave a brief speech about community service and the importance of recognizing people who made differences in quiet, consistent ways. Then Mrs. Patterson from the book club, who I hadn't known was on the foundation's board, stepped forward to introduce me. "This year's recipient," she began, "represents the kind of community member we should all aspire to be. Someone who shows up not when it's convenient, but when it's needed. Someone who contributes not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do." She told stories I didn't know she'd noticed, how I'd helped elderly library patrons navigate the new computer system, stayed late to help with children's reading programs, worked extra hours in the garden during the hottest part of summer because the plants needed tending. Small acts that had felt natural at the time, but apparently had been observed and valued by people I'd barely realized were paying attention. Margaret Morrison reminds us that service isn't about grand gestures, Mrs. Patterson concluded. It's about the daily choice to show up for your community with generosity, patience, and genuine care for others' well-being. When she called my name, I walked to the small podium feeling like I was moving through a dream. The applause was warm and genuine, and as I looked out at the audience, I saw faces of people who knew me not as someone's mother or former employee, but as Margaret, a person who mattered in her own right. I'd prepared brief remarks, but standing there with the certificate in my hands and $5,000 in prize money that represented more financial freedom than I'd had in decades, different words came out. 6 months ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the small room. I didn't know most of you. I was living a very small life, defined entirely by how useful I could be to other people, how well I could anticipate and meet their needs. I found Michael in the audience, his face attentive in a way it hadn't been when directed toward me in years. But this community taught me something I'd forgotten, that I have value not just for what I can do for others, but for who I am, that my thoughts and contributions matter, that showing up for people who genuinely want me there feels different than trying to earn space in places where I'm merely tolerated. The words were coming from a place deeper than I'd planned to access, a reservoir of truth I'd been protecting even from myself. I spent so many years believing that love meant accepting whatever time and attention people were willing to give me, grateful for whatever small place I could occupy in their lives. But serving in this community has reminded me that real love, the kind worth having, doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller. It doesn't require you to apologize for existing or to earn basic human dignity through service. Amanda was leaning forward now, her polite mask of attention replaced by something sharper, more focused. Michael's face had gone very still. The most important thing I've learned this year is that when you stop chasing after people who are pulling away from you, you create space for connections with people who actually want you present. When you stop trying to prove your worth to those who've decided you don't have any, you discover communities that have been waiting to welcome exactly who you are. I paused, looking directly at my son for the first time since I'd begun speaking. This award isn't just recognition for volunteer work. It's validation that the woman I am today, not the woman I was 30 years ago, not the woman others might want me to become, is worthy of respect and appreciation. And that's a gift I'll treasure far more than any monetary prize. The applause that followed seemed to last forever, and when it finally faded, people stood to approach me with congratulations and invitations, and the kind of warm recognition that I'd been starving for without realizing it. But I was watching Michael. He sat in his chair while Amanda whispered something urgent in his ear, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly. But also something that might have been shame, or recognition, or the dawning awareness that his mother had just delivered a speech that was partly about him without ever mentioning his name. When the formal part of the ceremony ended and people began mingling over cake and coffee, Michael finally approached me. His face was carefully controlled, but I could see tension in his shoulders, uncertainty in the way he held himself. "Mom," he said quietly, that was quite a speech. "Thank you. Listen, I was thinking, maybe we could take you out to dinner tonight. To celebrate? There's this new place Amanda heard about." I looked at him, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who'd spent the past year treating me like an embarrassing obligation, and felt something settle into place inside my chest. "That's very generous of you both," I said, "but I already have plans." Dorothy and some of the other women are taking me out, and I don't want to disappoint them. It was true. The book club had indeed planned a celebration dinner, but more than that, it was a choice. For perhaps the first time in our adult relationship, I was choosing people who celebrated me over someone who'd suddenly decided I might be worth his time. Michael blinked, clearly not expecting to be declined. Oh, well, maybe tomorrow then? Let me check my calendar, I said, the same words I'd used months earlier when he'd first begun to realize I wasn't always available when he decided to reach out. Amanda appeared at his elbow, her expression bright with the kind of forced enthusiasm that people use when they're trying to manage an uncomfortable situation. Margaret, what an inspiring speech, she said. So moving, and what wonderful work you're doing in the community. We had no idea you were so involved. As if my having a life outside of their awareness was surprising rather than inevitable. Yes, I said simply. It's been a very fulfilling year. We stood there for a moment, the three of us, in the kind of silence that suggests everyone is waiting for someone else to navigate the conversation toward safer ground. But I felt no obligation to make them comfortable, no need to smooth over the obvious tension, or pretend that everything was fine between us. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. We should probably get going, traffic and all. Of course, I said. Thank you for coming. It meant something to me that you were here. And it had, though not in the way he probably assumed. Their presence had served as a kind of witness to my transformation, evidence that the woman who'd once begged for their scraps of attention had become someone who could speak her truth publicly and with dignity. As they made their way toward the exit, I heard Amanda's voice, not quite low enough to avoid carrying. Well, that was certainly something. Very emotional. I had no idea she felt that way. Michael's response was quieter, but I caught it anyway. Yeah, me neither. Two words that confirmed what I'd suspected, that the man I'd raised had been so focused on his new life that he'd never bothered to consider what his withdrawal might have cost the woman who'd given him everything. But instead of the familiar stab of pain that such recognition would have caused a year ago, I felt something different. Relief, perhaps. Or maybe just the satisfaction of finally being seen clearly, even if that clarity came too late to change the fundamental dynamics between us. The weeks that followed the ceremony brought changes I hadn't anticipated. Michael called more frequently, but the conversations felt different now. Careful, almost tentative, as if he was speaking to someone he was just getting to know rather than the woman who'd raised him. How's the garden project going? He'd ask, his voice carrying genuine curiosity that hadn't been present in months. Very well, I'd tell him. We're planning a summer festival to showcase what we've grown. The whole community is getting involved. That sounds really great, Mom. Really meaningful. Another word that suggested he was reassessing his understanding of who I was and what my life contained. I answered his questions politely, shared appropriate details about my activities, but I no longer felt the desperate need to hold his attention or prove my worth through elaborate explanations of everything I was doing. The distance between us had shifted quality. Before, it had been the painful space created by his withdrawal and my unsuccessful attempts to bridge it. Now it felt more like the respectful space between two adults who were still learning how to relate to each other as equals, rather than as parent and dependent child. Amanda began including me in family plans again, but the invitations came with a different energy. Instead of the grudging politeness I'd grown accustomed to, there was something that resembled actual interest in my presence. We're having people over for Michael's promotion celebration, she said during one of his calls. Nothing fancy, just a barbecue, but we'd love for you to come if you're free. If I was free. The conditional phrasing acknowledged something that hadn't been acknowledged before, that I might have my own plans, my own commitments, my own life, that didn't revolve around being available whenever they decided to include me. Let me check my calendar, I said, the response that had become my standard reply to last-minute invitations. I did go to the barbecue, but I arrived with a dish I'd wanted to make rather than something designed to impress Amanda's friends. I stayed for exactly the amount of time that felt comfortable to me, participating in conversations I found interesting and politely excusing myself from ones that didn't engage me. When Michael walked me to my car at the end of the evening, he seemed to want to say something more substantial than the usual polite goodbye. Mom, he began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair the way he'd done as a child when he was working up courage for a difficult conversation. Yes? I've been thinking about what you said at the ceremony. About about making space for people who actually want you present. I waited, giving him room to continue or retreat as he chose. I think I lost sight of something important, he said finally. Somewhere along the way, I started taking you for granted, started treating you like you'd always be there, no matter how little effort I put into our relationship. The words I'd wanted to hear for months hung in the evening air between us. But instead of the relief and validation I'd once thought such an acknowledgement would bring, I felt something quieter and more complex. I appreciate you saying that, I told him. It means something to me that you've noticed. I want to do better, he continued. I want us to have a real relationship, not just obligation calls and duty visits. I looked at my son, this man I'd shaped from childhood into someone I was genuinely proud of, despite the recent strain between us. He was trying, in his way, to rebuild something he'd allowed to deteriorate. The question was whether I still had the energy and desire to meet him halfway. What would that look like to you? I asked. A real relationship? He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him genuinely considering the question rather than offering an automatic response. I don't know exactly, he admitted. But maybe it starts with me actually paying attention to who you are now instead of just seeing you as the person who raised me. You've built this whole life I knew nothing about. You're involved in things that matter to you. You have friends and interests and accomplishments that have nothing to do with being my mother. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to me in years. Yes, I agreed simply. I have. I'd like to know more about that life, if you're willing to share it with me. The conversation that followed was different from any we'd had since his marriage. He asked questions about the community garden, about the book club, about my volunteering at the library. Not polite, perfunctory questions, but real curiosity about activities that clearly brought me satisfaction and joy. I found myself telling him about Mrs. Chen's grandchildren, who came to story time and had started calling me Miss Margaret, with the kind of affection that made my heart warm. About the garden's summer festival, where I'd been asked to coordinate the children's activities because of my experience with the library programs. About Dorothy and Linda and the other women who'd become genuine friends rather than just pleasant acquaintances. As I spoke, I watched Michael's face and saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. Not the automatic respect owed to a parent, but the earned respect given to someone whose life and choices you actually admire. I'm proud of you, Mom, he said as our conversation wound down. I know that probably sounds strange coming from your son, but I really am proud of what you've built for yourself. The words settled into my chest with a warmth I'd almost forgotten how to feel. Not because I needed his approval anymore, but because it was nice to be seen clearly by someone who'd once known me so well. 3 months later, I used part of the award money to take a trip I'd been dreaming about for years. A week in Tuscany, traveling with a small group organized by the community college. Dorothy came with me, and we spent days wandering through hillside villages and art galleries, eating meals that lasted for hours, and learning basic Italian phrases from patient locals. I sent Michael photos from the trip, not because I needed to justify my choices or prove that I was living an interesting life, but because I wanted to share beautiful moments with someone I loved. His responses were immediate and enthusiastic, full of questions about what I was seeing and doing. When I returned, tan and relaxed and full of stories about the art classes I'd taken and the people I'd met, Michael and Amanda invited me to dinner specifically to hear about my travels. They looked at my photos with genuine interest, asked about the food and the language and the landscapes I'd experienced. You look so happy in these pictures, Amanda observed, studying a photo of me laughing with our tour group in front of a centuries-old church. Really, radiant. I liked that word, liked the way it suggested light coming from within rather than reflected from external sources. The relationship Michael and I built over the following year was different from what we'd had before, but it was also deeper and more honest. We saw each other less frequently, but the time we spent together was more intentional, more mutually enjoyable. Our conversations covered topics that interested both of us, rather than just polite check-ins about health and weather. He started asking for my advice again, not about domestic matters, but about real decisions he was facing at work and in his marriage. I found myself sharing my own challenges and victories with the kind of openness that's only possible between equals who respect each other's judgment. The desperate ache I'd carried for so long, the need to be needed, to be central to his life, to be valued above all other relationships, had been replaced by something more sustainable, the contentment that comes from being genuinely known and appreciated by someone you love. On my 58th birthday, Michael and Amanda threw me a surprise party at the community center, inviting not just family, but all the people who'd become important to me over the past year. Dorothy and Linda were there, along with Mrs. Chen and her grandchildren, the book club women, several families from the garden project. As I looked around the room at these two groups of people, my family and my chosen community, I realized something had fundamentally shifted in my understanding of what it meant to be loved. The frantic need to be everything to one person had been replaced by the deeper satisfaction of being valued by many people for different reasons. The cake was beautiful, decorated with flowers from the community garden, and when Michael stood to make a toast, his words carried the kind of genuine affection that can't be manufactured or performed. "To my mom," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be, who showed me that real strength isn't about holding on to things that are slipping away, but about having the courage to build something new when the old structures stop serving you." The room filled with applause and laughter, and as I looked around at all these faces, some familiar from years of friendship, others newer but no less valued, I felt the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing you've chosen well, not just chosen the right people to spend time with, but chosen the right version of yourself to offer to the world, the version that insists on being seen clearly, that refuses to accept love that requires you to diminish yourself, that understands the difference between being wanted and being tolerated. Later that evening, as the party wound down and people began gathering their things to leave, Michael approached me with the same careful manner he'd had during our conversation after the ceremony. "Mom, I need you to know something," he said quietly. "That night when I called you my old maid, I've regretted those words every day since, not just because they were cruel, but because they were so completely wrong. You've never been anyone's maid. You've always been extraordinary." I looked at my son, this man who'd learned to see me clearly again, who'd done the difficult work of rebuilding a relationship he'd almost destroyed through neglect and carelessness. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, "and thank you for showing up to do better. Not everyone is brave enough to admit when they've been wrong. I learned it from you," he said, smiling. "The being brave part, the showing up part, all of it." As the last guest departed and I stood in my quiet apartment, surrounded by cards and flowers and the lingering warmth of celebration, I understood that the story I'd been living wasn't about revenge or dramatic confrontations or forcing people to recognize my worth. It was about something much quieter and more powerful, the decision to stop waiting for other people to give you permission to value yourself. The courage to build a life so fulfilling that rejection stops feeling like devastation and starts feeling like redirection toward something better. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth, not the silence of withdrawal or defeat, but the silence of someone who no longer needs to justify her existence to people who've forgotten how to appreciate her presence. The silence of a woman who's learned that the most profound victory isn't making others see your worth. It's seeing it so clearly yourself that their blindness becomes irrelevant.